Welcome all to the first of our three-part series on Judaism and race. This is a joint program of Stephen Wise Temple and the American Jewish Community of Los Angeles. We recommend that you click the speaker view icon on your Zoom interface. That will allow you to actually not have tiles of everyone speaking, but just have the speaker, the person who's addressing you directly on your screen. Of course, if you like the gallery view, you can stay with that as well. I'm Rabbi Ron Stern at Stephen Wise Temple. I'm the director of the Center for Tikkun Olam. The goal of this three-part series, and we do hope you will join us for all of our three sessions, is to move closer, to help move us all closer, and this is a long process. We recognize that this is just the beginning, but closer towards creating an anti-racist Jewish community. Recognizing it's the beginning, we have to start somewhere, and so we need to start by educating ourselves and increasing our awareness of issues that, in truth, heretofore have not been addressed adequately. The title for the series, Judaism and Race, reflects a conscious decision of we, the organizers, to acknowledge that somewhere between 6 and 10% of the Jewish community is not white. Recognize that by saying things like, well, we don't recognize when we say things like Jews and blacks without acknowledging that Jews are blacks as well as members of the African-American community. And by saying things like Jews and blacks, we marginalize Jews who are black or brown. And it's also an affirmation of the idea of this program, that is, and the name Judaism and Race, is that to truly become anti-racist, the first step is to talk about race openly, and if necessary, with the high holidays just behind us, with a sense of teshuvah, that is, recognizing that we are not clear of past sins and going at this with a true commitment to changing our future behavior. It takes work, but this is the beginning. So, or I should say a beginning. Tonight's session is called Lessons and Legacies from the Past, and it looks at the history of Judaism and race relations. Where did we do well? Where were we lacking? And what happened to get us to where we are today? Your moderator will be Saba Soomekh, and the panelists are Professor Marc Dollinger and Robin Washington from B'chol Lashon Global Jews. Saba will introduce the folks in more detail, and you also, of course, saw their bios on the slideshow at the beginning. The next program in 2 weeks will be Perspectives on the Present. That's October 28th at the same time. And we're going to look at some of the difficult challenges in our world today. Black Lives Matter, anti-Semitism, Jewish racism. How does the past inform our present? Why are so many young Jews embracing anti-racist causes? And why do those issues resonate so powerfully with them? And how do we reconcile questions about Israel and Zionism that are raised in the non-Jewish Black community? 2 weeks after that, the session is entitled Contemplating the Future, Challenges and Opportunities. That's November 11th. And in this session, we're looking at restoring the historic relationship on new terms, how to reach an understanding and an empathy for effective advocacy and mutual support, and really asking the question, what do non-Black Jews need to learn? And as you saw in the slides, the moderators for each of these are representatives of the Black Jewish community and representatives of each of our organizations. I want to extend my gratitude on behalf of my planning partners, Marc Graboff, who is both a WISE member and the board chair of AJC LA, Rick Hirschhout, who's the executive director of AJC LA, and Saba Soomekh, who's the associate director of AJC LA. And in addition, many of the voices, both members of Stephen Wise and our professional staff, who shared their input to help us design a program that we came to understand would reflect the objective most effectively. Finally, before I turn it over to Saba, let me just explain how we will handle questions. At the bottom of your screen, you see a Q&A icon. What we'd like you to do is post your questions in the Q&A icon. Some of the silent moderators will actually review the questions and edit them and try to condense the ones that are similar and provide them to the active moderator, to Ms. Soomekh. And from that, she'll be able to select questions which she will then pose to the panelists. So with that, I would like to turn the screen and microphone over to Saba Soomekh, the Associate Director of AJC LA, and thank her for her participation.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Stern. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our three-part series entitled The Jewish Community and Race, Lessons and Legacies of the Past. As Rabbi Stern said, my name is Dr. Saba Soomekh, and I have the privilege of being the Associate Director of AJC Los Angeles. AJC and Stephen Wise are excited to have these timely conversations, and I am honored to moderate the first session where we will look at the history of Judaism and race relations. I would like to introduce you to our two panelists, Robin Washington and Professor Marc Dollinger. Robin Washington is a journalist, filmmaker, and co-founder of the Alliance of Black Jews. His major work is a landmark PBS documentary, You Don't Have to Ride Jim Crow, about the origins of the civil rights movements. His commentaries have appeared in scores of newspapers around the world, including the Jewish Press, as well as in books edited by Ishmael Reed and Charles Ogletree. A weekly show host for Wisconsin Public Radio, Robin has also appeared on NPR, BET, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, and many other broadcast outlets. Dr. Marc Dollinger holds the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University. Professor Dollinger is the author of 4 scholarly books in American Jewish history, and most recently, his book, Black Power in Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. Dr. Dollinger is a past president of both the Jewish Community High School of the Bay and Brandeis Hillel Day School. He sits on the California Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, was named Volunteer of the Year by San Francisco Jewish Community Federation, and was awarded the San Francisco JCRC's Courageous Leader Award. Thank you both for being here. So I just want to make sure, Marc and thank you, Robin. We got you back. And
we're here.
Great. And Marc, we would love to see you.
I am here, but the host has to let me start my video.
Okay.
There we go. How's that?
Wonderful.
All good?
This is good. This is good. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all so much. So, Marc, we're going to start with you. And just diving into your book. You talk about what academics refer to as historical memory, where you say we tend to remember what we want to remember, we tend to forget what we want to forget, and people tend to spin the evidence in a prearranged thesis. Now, while we often see the image of Rabbi Herschel marching from Selma with Martin Luther King Jr. in 1965, this image doesn't actually represent most Ashkenazi Jews at that time. According to your research, the typical white American Jew in the 1960s was at home, in the suburbs, supporting the movement theoretically, but not actually marching. So Marc, what is the narrative of the Jewish community regarding Black Jewish Alliance, and how historically accurate is this?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. And I'll open with the fact that I'm actually an Angelino, and I was raised in the South Bay of LA in the Reform movement in the 70s. And what I learned sort of growing up in Sunday school and religious school was that classic image of Heschel and King. And we have to start by talking about how extraordinary that was, how brave it was for these white Ashkenazi Jews. Jews were disproportionately represented. And we had a lot of cases where even a majority of the white people in any room in the South in the civil rights movement would have been Jews. So these are my definition of heroes, right, in history. And there's more to the story. While some of the Jews went to the South, most didn't. And in fact, the more I did academic research on the topic, the more I realized that not only was there incredible insight and understanding about the threats posed by systemic racism, there was also understanding even among Jewish communal leaders, tended to be middle-aged white Jewish men who understood the limits of white Jewish liberalism. And they understood that there's things that allies can do, and there's a point at which allies can no longer. So, I'm fascinated a little by the history, but more by how sort of part of the history got remembered over the decades, and part of it, even that recognized at the time, has sort of been forgotten. So my work is to try to bring back the fullness and the richness and the detail to show how complex it is.
Marc, how has your research been, what has been the response of the Jewish community, because you've presented a different Black Jewish paradigm?
Yeah, so to be nice, I'll say folks are surprised, right? Because, you know, certainly people, you know, in my generation and even a few around it, were raised with really a self-congratulatory idea, which for its own sake is definitely worthy. But they were surprised to find that much of the awareness that a lot of white America has come to since the murder of George Floyd and our national reckoning on race is something that was actually understood by Jewish civil rights leaders back in the day. So first, it's curiosity. Some folks are challenged because it's hard to have a vision and a thought of your past and then sort of to be presented with evidence that challenges it. And in the last few months especially, I'm getting a lot of feedback of appreciation because folks are better able to understand a lot of the contemporary scene if they have a more varied sense of the American Jewish past.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Robin, you're a journalist, you're a broadcaster, you're a documentarian, and you're also a Black Jew who grew up in an interracial family where you've been participating in protests since you were 3 years old. How does your background influence your work that you do today? How does your experience affect your relationship with both the Jewish community, the Black community, and can you also talk about your documentary?
Okay, well, that's a lot. So, and I'm tempted to congratulate, but also make some comments on Professor Dollinger's work, but only if we get to it. So, but I was there, as many people in the movement will tell you. Granted, as you just said, I was 3 years old. My friend Claiborne Carson, a great historian, defines the civil rights movement, by the way, as starting when I got into it and ending when I left. So Marc and I could be talking about two entirely different movements. My family's involvement was the 50s and the early 60s. And in fact, left in 1963. I can tell you exactly when and why, but we'll get to that, or we probably won't. The main things that my parents, my father was Black and not Jewish. My mother was Jewish and not Black. I say that because, as Rabbi Stern said, you can be both. It is totally normal to be both. They are not mutually exclusive, and it warms my heart to hear him say that because I've been writing this for 40-odd years. I've been saying it all my life, and to hear words, to hear those words again, becoming part of the mainstream is wonderful. And that's the way I was taught. You hear people talk about my family taught me, what you get into that too. My parents were extremely deliberate as to what they were doing. First of all, they got married in 52, and they got divorced 8 years later, but still stayed in the same neighborhood. That was deliberate too, so that my brother and I could see both of them anytime we wanted. They made it normal for us to be Black and Jewish. We had seders with another Black Jewish family. How normal is that? So, I mean, if you're wondering, are there others like us, we're sitting there hiding in the afikomen with somebody that looks like us and fighting over it too. My mother was an officer of Chicago Corps, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the Chicago NAACP. And she, as you said, took us to marches and sit-ins when I was 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. I remember them like yesterday. Most of them were about housing and de facto segregation in Chicago public schools. I have no memory of not knowing, if you follow my double negatives, what it was about. I always knew what we were doing, why we were at the sit-in, why we are marching to Deerfield for open housing, and I can't remember not knowing it. I remember a reporter at this major sit-in we had asking if I was scared. And I looked around and I saw my foster sister. I saw my brother playing chess with a neighbor. I saw another neighbor. My mother's in the next room negotiating. So I said, why would I be scared? This is like being in my living room. And in fact, all these people had been in my living room. You asked how it informs me as a journalist. I became a journalist because rather than protesting, leading movements and all, I thought I could affect change best through mainstream journalism to reach a large number of people. That's what mainstream journalism is supposed to do. And so in Boston, I spent from Chicago, was in Minnesota, Boston for 17 years, and for 15 years been back in Minnesota. One of the places I worked was the Boston Herald, taking on the Boston Globe in the height of the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal. There was, I remember at the very beginning, a lone protester outside of a venue where Cardinal Law was gathering all the priests. And I asked the other reporters, who's that? Oh, he's some kook. He's protesting something about abuse, says he's a victim, but nobody knows his priest, and there's no evidence the guy did anything. But I still went over and talked to him because it's January, it's Boston, it's cold. Protesting is a normal thing for me. So I figure this guy has got to have a reason he's there. Long story short about it, no, you couldn't prove his case that day, but within a month you certainly could. He ended up becoming one of the leaders of the victims movement. And of course, I was, had great access to him because I spoke to him in the first place. So, and later on, his priest was indeed determined to be an abuser. So to cut this at this point, you can see how this influences my approach to journalism. I'll just say that Judaism and journalism and justice are my three religions.
And then you're one of the three co-founders of the Alliance of Black Jews. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you felt that there was a need for this?
So having said everything I just said, and getting tired of saying it, the people that they're not mutually exclusive, you can be Black and Jewish. If in 1995, you said Black Jew, all you got was a joke about Sammy Davis Jr. I know a good one, actually. Actually, is Sammy Davis Jr. was getting on a bus in Alabama, and the driver said, get to the back. He says, but I'm Jewish. Get off. You're supposed to laugh. Okay? That's not that bad. That was actually one told in my family, but that's not the point. The point is, it's way more than him. It's interesting, by the way, which Blacks and which Jews in general, the Jewish mainstream considers someone looking up to. So it's kind of interesting that Sammy Davis Jr. actually broke that barrier. But in any case, we, and I can tell you more about who we are later, but there's a great diversity of Black American Jews, which is basically who I'm talking about. I love Ethiopians. I know quite a few. They're not who we were talking about. Actually, the Alliance of Black Jews was meant to be worldwide, but we were basically talking about the situation in the United States. And very briefly, we came up with a number, 200,000, which actually matched the numbers that the Council of Jewish Federations had just commissioned, but they were running away from. In a broad definition of who is a Jew, they came up with 240,000 Black Jews around that time, 1995. And in a narrow definition, 120,000. So our estimate of 200,000 was right in the middle. But they didn't want to accept the researchers' number. They said, oh, it's probably wrong. We think there's more like 50 or 60,000. And that's political. That was not scientific or empirical. Lastly, again, I could get into all the different varieties of African-American Jews or African descent Jews as much as you want. One interesting, just a guy I met, he was wearing a yarmulke walking down the street in Newton, Massachusetts. I said, hey, you. I don't do this anymore. But at the time, we were looking for people. And I said, why are you wearing that yarmulke? He says, because I'm Jewish. It turned out, even though everybody in this forum, I'm sure, obviously knows it is insulting, inappropriate to ask Black Jews or white Jews or any other Jews or Jews of color, how you became Jewish. We actually did want to know this about ourselves. And what's interesting about this guy is his answer was, I don't know. Our family, we always were. We don't know. Well, think about that. There are white Jews who haven't done their family history
Right.
and don't know why either, but nobody asks why.
Right. Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Marc, this question is for you. And again, going back to your book, you discuss, well, can you discuss how the Black Power movement and Black nationalism of the 1970s, 80s, et cetera, actually became an inspiration for the American Jewish community and their leaders, especially when it came to issues such as the Soviet Jewry movement, the rise of Zionism, and the public expressions of Judaism in America. Can you expound on that for a little?
Yeah, this was really one of the surprising insights that I was able to find in the archives. When I was growing up, the story was that the Black-Jewish alliance was great in the years of Heschel and King. And then with the rise of Black power, anti-Israelism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism at times, there was a purge of whites from leadership, which meant a purge from Jews. And, you know, in the mid-60s, the good times were over. And now, you know, blaming Black power activists and Black nationalist activists for what happened. Well, I started reading about the Soviet Jewry movement to start. And the first bit of research was actually on my dissertation, and I was investigating the freedom rides. And by accident, I came up with a document in the archives that said Freedom Rides 1971, which is a typographical error because the Freedom Rides were a decade earlier. So I pulled out the folder. Sure enough, it was a 1971 Freedom Ride for Soviet Jews from Washington, D.C. to Seattle. And the Soviet Jewry movement had taken the language of the civil rights movement and now deployed it to help fellow Jews. About a third of the Soviet Jewry activists were trained in the civil rights movement. Now, Soviet Jewry movement used anti-communism as their technique to get political support in Washington. Now, we'd like to think the US Senate wants to help Jews. They probably want to make the communists look bad a little bit more. So by bringing together anti-communism with pro-Jewish, they were able to get the US Senate to pass the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. Maybe a lot of people watching might even remember that. Well, if you were going to play anti-communism to help Soviet Jews, you should have done this in the mid-50s or early 1950s, at the time when McCarthy and McCarthyism was huge. But they didn't, right? Because in the 1950s, the last thing American Jews wanted to do in the suburb was take to the streets for their Jewishness. Soviet Jewry movement nationalized in 1964. At the time, Black power was expanding the limits of acceptable ethnic expression for lots of groups, Jews included. I wrote on the Jews. But so now in the late 60s and early 70s, American Jews are acting and behaving in many ways like Black power activists were doing the same. And so I argue there would not have been a Soviet Jewry movement had there not been a Black power movement. And the parallel is even more striking around Zionism. Because after the 1967 Six-Day War, American Jews responded so enthusiastically to Israel that it even shocked American Jewish leaders. In New York City, they raised $18 million in 1 hour at a lunch.
Wow, right.
$67. 7,500 Jewish college students got on planes and flew to Israel. And I argue, you know, if you're a young Jewish progressive and you were in the civil rights movement and Black power comes and says, look, you know, we're into Black nationalism, everyone should go discover themselves. And then in less than a week, Israel has a dramatic military victory. All right, 97% of American Jews expressed strong sympathy for the state of Israel after that war. I don't think we're going to find today 97% of American Jews showing that. And I have a few quotes which I thought were fascinating. I started looking through rabbinic sermons, since we have Rabbi Stern here, right? Rabbi Dov Peretz Elkins, who was in Philadelphia at the time, said in one of his sermons, Black power is nothing more and nothing less than Negro Zionism. Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg referred to Stokely Carmichael, the leader of Black Power, as the most radical kind of Negro Zionist. He talks exactly the language of those Jews who felt most violently angry at the sight of Hitler and most hurt by the good people who stood aside. So at the moment when there's so much fractiousness and tension, synagogue goers are actually hearing connections between Black Power and Zionism.
Wonderful. Fascinating. So, so interesting. I'm a big fan of your book and I use it in my own lectures. So I really do suggest people go out and purchase it. And Robin, I would love to talk to you. Just talking about the Jewish community, Black Jewish community specifically, how can Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews be better allies to the Black Jewish community and the Black community in general? And what role can Black Jews play in bridging the relationship?
If I can answer part of the second one first, or
Yes,
really,
of course.
I just can't contain myself, but I need to make a comment on Professor Dollinger's statement just now. The original Black Power Conference in 1967 in Newark, New Jersey, was chaired by the Reverend Dr. Nathan Wright, who was one of the people on the first Freedom Ride that took place in 1947. He is one of the people that was in my documentary, You Don't Have to Ride Jim Crow, which is all about that ride. This is way in the beginning. Martin Luther King was a teenager. No one ever heard of him. The people on that ride were amazing. One was Bayard Rustin, who later went on to lead the march, to direct the March on Washington, I should say, in the background. And I got to know most of the people on the ride, and it's one of the biggest things in my life. One of the things about Nathan Wright was he was a pacifist. And until he died, he said he still was a pacifist, yet the chair of the Black Power Conference. The other point I need to make is that, as you say, most Jews did not participate in the civil rights movement, get on the buses, go on the freedom rides. Most Blacks in the very beginning, when you go back to 1947, didn't either. These guys were wild-eyed radicals. They wore suits and ties and fedoras, but they were very radical, and it's a very special person to be able to do that. So keep in mind, these things change as they become, as you said, more politically acceptable. And the knowledge base that's gained from one experience very much is important to future experiences. So lessons from the ride of 47 informed the ride of 61, and lessons from the pacifism, if you will, of Nathan Wright, which he practiced even while chairing the Black Power Conference, informed later movements, even as the movement got decidedly less pacifist. So to your question, Saba, of how Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews can be better allies, now that we've set the tone of these groups and the need for allies and to the Black community. I have a simple answer for that: is stop being white.
What does that mean, though, Robin? What does that mean? What does that mean?
Yes, and I say that only to those who think they are. If your last name is like yours, Saba, or your complexion is like mine or yours, regardless of how you think of yourself, how I think of myself, I am most likely going to be perceived as not white in America. I am lighter than a lot of Black people, darker than a lot of Black people, but when people see me, they may think I'm Black, they may think I'm Jewish, they may think whatever, usually is I'm something, and I'm definitely not white. Race changes constantly over time, over space. 100 years ago, Finns were not white in America. I'm sitting here in Minnesota, which we have plenty of Finns. There definitely are more white people today. They weren't back then. Trust me, I've got documentary evidence on it. Jews weren't likely white either. And in fact, at the beginning of the civil rights movement, which may have something to do with who did or didn't participate, Jews most likely didn't consider themselves white. And interestingly, from the gains of the movement, had successes that brought them into whiteness, if you will. So Mizrahi and Sephardim in their home countries may be like everyone else. Usually you are in your home countries. I've done a lot of studying when I did a survey of the diversity of boards of Jewish organizations, very exhaustive, of looking at people who had, say, Hispanic names, but turn out to have German or Ukrainian backgrounds. Why? Because their families are from Germany. There's a my favorite is Mario Kreuzenberg. You probably don't know that name, but you probably do know, or many people watching this would have to know, Don Francisco. He was the host of Sábado Gigante, watched by 100 million people every week, Big Saturday. It was on Univision. It was the most watched television program, variety show in the world. He is the, if you want to call it, archetypical Hispanic man. His story is his family, like mine, were German Jews. They left because of the Holocaust, in advance of the Holocaust, and went to South America. There, Mario was born. When you're in South America and you want to fit in, you name your child Mario. Mario learns how to do television, and he starts a show. It becomes popular. He signs with Univision. He moves it to Miami. So in Germany, they weren't white. In South America, they were white. In Miami, you can say all you want about white Hispanic, black Hispanic, whatever. He ain't white. Most people would not consider him white. So this would apply to Sephardim and Mizrahi Jews too. In the United States, I don't think they would be perceived as white. And I'll just end with this part, is Black people historically are very embracing to others in the same situation. We love other people in the same situation, but we're not terribly fond of people who pass, and which goes for Black people who pass too, because you're basically rejecting both the community and your own family, and you're saying there's something wrong with us, even if it's for the gain that you're going to get. You get to be a doctor, you get to be a lawyer, whatever. So if people identify themselves as people of color, I think that's the start.
Right, thank you. And I have so many questions, and our audience also has so many questions. But Robin, I do want to touch upon something that you wrote in the Jewish Journal that I thought was really interesting. You wrote this in July 2020, where the title of your article is "Appoint Black Jews to Major Organization Boards Now." So can you talk about your op-ed quickly, if that's okay, and the fact that Black Jewish representation is basically 0.2% on Jewish boards?
Right, and Rabbi gave some numbers in the beginning that Jews of color are at least 6% of the population. Black Jews are at least 2%. Those are low estimates. So I'm going to go with the lowest one to give as much credence as possible to anyone who wants to doubt the survey. I and my assistant, he's a total numbers cruncher. He loves this stuff. We went through the entire list of 50 plus groups that comprise the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. Their total board membership of all the organizations together are more than 2,000 people. 2 Black Jews sit on the boards of those 50-odd organizations. There were more Jews of color. And again, I was very broad about that. We counted Mizrahi, we counted Sephardi, whether the people counted themselves or not.
Right.
And that got to be 20. So you had 0.2%, which by no definition is the representative of the population of Black Jews, or the percentage of Black Jews in the larger American Jewish community, and 2%, which again is no way the representation of Jews of color in the American Jewish community. So I point out, yes, I had an op-ed, but also the study as well. And the op-ed could say all my journalistic things and my op-ed things, which is basically put up or shut up. The organizations at that time that came out with that last summer had almost to a group, all had pronouncements, statements of support with Black people, promises to work together, strong statements saying racism must end now, we must do what we can now. Look at your own boards. It begins with your boards. I'm sorry, the American Jewish Committee is one of those groups that has 0 Black members on their board. There are a couple of groups, by the way, that had Black members who weren't Jewish, which I thought was a little odd. So you couldn't find Black Jews, but you found whatever. There were only 2. I digress on this, but I couldn't say it strongly enough.
No, you're
And
right.
lastly, I will say about board members, you can get into a lot of groups have begun to hire people in the special positions. I'm thrilled to see your job, Saba. But
I'm constantly challenging the Ashkenormative environments of Jewish organizations, synagogues, and yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Absolutely
and
right.
so the last point I'll make about that is hiring people. There are 2 standards of hiring people. I've hired many. Are qualified or unqualified, and you can get in the backgrounds of whatever. You don't hire a doctor if they don't have a medical degree. Fine. You can put anyone on a board and you can do it tomorrow.
Right.
And so this has to happen.
The challenge is out there. Thank you so much. We're going to now turn to our audience and our audience questions. And Marc, I will pose this to you. And of course, Robin, please, if you would like to answer after Marc, wonderful. Beyond the very public relationship of King and Heschel, what other meaningful and notable connections existed over the years between the Jewish community and the non-Jewish Black community?
That's a great question, and my answer is actually not a positive one so much. There have been, of course, relationships between, non-Black Jews and Blacks. In the U.S. Congress, there has been off and on over the years sort of a Black-Jewish political alliance. There has been grassroots work amongst Jewish civil rights organizations or Jewish social justice groups. But the main overarching story is one that has seen Ashkenazi Jews rising in economic and social prominence, which has then brought Jews into basically all white communities or communities where there's very few Blacks living. And without that proximity, without the sense to engage or interact with folks from different groups, it tends to self-perpetuate.
Wonderful. Robin, do you want to add to that?
I have to disagree a bit. First of all, I exist. So I happen somehow, right? My parents got together, and they're the exact demographic you're talking about. Now, if you're talking a little bit later, well, my daughter exists, although her mother was Jewish, and I'm Jewish too, so no intermarriage there. But seriously, her generation, there's a whole lot of people. The beauty today is when we started the Alliance of Black Jews, I pretty much knew everybody except for my friend walking down the street, right? But I don't know all these young people, my daughter's generation and the generation following. And so they're coming from somewhere. There's frankly a lot of reasons for this. There is intermarriage. During the Civil Rights Movement, I found a statistic, I can dig it up again, that said of of Jews who intermarried racially, the partner was most likely Black, and of Jews who intermarried religiously, the partner was most likely Black. Of Blacks who intermarried racially, the partner was most likely Jewish. Again, you're right, people have moved on. You don't have those connections next door to each other as much, but Jews still gravitate towards circles that you're more likely to find Black people than other white people will. So that's one. The second thing is interracial adoption has exploded. The Black social workers had a stop more or less on adopting Black kids that was lifted about 20 years ago. And suddenly we have all kinds of white people adopting Black kids. Jews are part of that. They certainly are adopting all sorts of kids of color from around the world. And conversions, when you have a group of people doing something, it attracts attention. So if seriously at the time Sammy Davis was converting, he was the only one, or they had to think about it long and hard, as everybody should. You know, today you're gonna know somebody. And I think that's my last point is everybody knows somebody. Everybody knows a Black Jew. If you don't know one, you're not paying attention. So I don't know if I completely answer your question, but I do take a different take as to whether or not, you know, we do have the interaction or the numbers.
So then the question I ask, and when our audience also asks, is where did the distance happen? How did this happen that has taken us to where we are today with this distance between the Jewish community and the Black non-Jewish community? Mark, do you want to answer first, and then Robin?
Yeah. So this is actually part of a larger social trend from 1945. So it's sort of like white presenting Ashkenazi Jews, whatever language we want to use for this, were not considered white in the 1920s and 30s. And really, and this is the work of Karen Brodkin and Eric Goldstein, sort of make the case that after World War II, when the anti-Semitic restrictions are being lifted throughout American society, but the anti-Black restrictions are not, we're now seeing a difference between white Ashkenazi Jews who used to live in urban areas in proximity to many ethnic, racial, diverse groups. And then you do this sort of, you know, generation after generation, we're going to end up here in the 21st century. I'll tell you, I've been doing a lot of Zoom talks on this history, and inevitably, you know, folks want to know what they can do. And when I start giving ideas, they're like, there is no Black people who live within miles of us. Where do we even start? So I think that's really a 60-year phenomenon, which is itself a reflection of the way in which systemic racism has played in order to separate communities on a socially constructed definition of race, to be sure, but the privilege, you know, was conferred. And
so Jews became white when? When were they considered to be white?
Through the 1950s is probably the best way to say it. By 1960, most of the anti-Semitic, you know, quotas and such that had been lifted. In 1945, right at the end of the war, there was still quite a bit of anti-Semitism. So I see it as about a 15-year process, and sort of coalesces with the modern civil rights movement in the 1950s.
Wonderful, thank you. Robin, would you like to add to that?
This is maybe a little bit hard to keep in your head, so I referenced an essay I have in a book by Ishmael Reed called Multi-America, and I discuss it, and you can read it in case you can't follow me here. It's short. The name of the essay is Black and Jewish Like Jesus and Me. But the part that speaks to what Marc is talking about is, I'd say, a kind of misfiring of how each group perceives itself. So go back to what I said earlier, that race is as much defined by people, how they perceive you, as how you perceive yourself. In fact, it could be more defined than that. We of a certain age remember when Tiger Woods got on the scene and he said he was Caucasian, Caucasian, Asian, and Black. Well, that's great, but Fuzzy Zoeller, the other famous golfer, when Tiger Woods won his first Masters and the winner gets to select the menu, Fuzzy Zoeller said, well, Tiger Woods is going to have fried chicken served. He didn't say pad thai, okay? So he interpreted Tiger Woods as Black, period, in the story, no matter what Tiger Woods thought of himself. So I asked the question. This is nowhere near the scholarship that Marc brings, okay? But it's journalistic. It does work that way. And seriously, my journalism, I practice fairness is the key. Giving everybody, a chance to make their viewpoint known. I asked Ashkenazi, white identifying, white appearing Jews of European descent who were not Black. How about that for a long qualifier? If they thought, if they identified as white, some did, some didn't. Those who identified as white, I asked, is there a problem of Black anti-Semitism? In other words, is there really a thing, I asked this 20 years ago before things were a thing, as Black anti-Semitism? Not can be Black to be anti-Semitic, everybody can. Jews can be anti-Semitic, as we are beginning to see, but that's a different story. So Jews who identify themselves as white said no. there's no real problem of Black anti-Semitism. It's not a thing, because if Black people don't like us, they don't like us because we're white. And after 400 years of slavery and oppression, it's pretty natural not to like the people who you identify with the oppression. Jews who, however, thought of themselves as something other than white, and this isn't necessarily just because of liberal causes and, you know, I want to be down with the group. Very Orthodox people think of themselves today. I would really say that. You'll find people who strongly do not think of themselves as white, or at least as white Americans, said, if Black people don't like us, why? It's because we are Jews, because they don't see themselves as white. Now, I asked Black people the same question, which is, what do you think of Jews? And the answers were basically, if I may quote James Baldwin, a different kind of white person who goes to church on Saturday instead of Sunday. So the point was that they were thinking that Blacks, you know, and again, using Blacks, Jews, whatever, but for convenience sake here, Blacks would express Jews or would interpret Jews as white people. But Jews did not necessarily see themselves as white people.
Right.
And those who did understood that Blacks didn't hate them because they were Jews, and those who didn't thought that Blacks hated them because they were Jews. That's what they did.
Right. So Robin, if we could ask you a personal question, how are you as a Jew and as an Israel supporter, how are you viewed within the Black Christian community?
You mean at the church my grandfather ran? I mean,
Sure,
you know,
yes.
we were Reverend Washington.
The Black non-Jewish, right? Or just at the within the Black community that is not Jewish.
I don't know how to answer that. You know, it's like saying, how am I viewed in the Jewish community? I like to think everybody loves me, right? I know a few people don't. I have to watch out for them. But no, seriously, I'm a journalist of 40 odd years. I'm very active in the National Association of Black Journalists. I have been the editor of a daily paper. You can count on both hands and maybe one foot the number of Black editors of daily paper ever in America. And so, you know, I was one of them. There's never been more than 10 at a time. I was the editor of the Duluth News Tribune here in Minnesota. And obviously that's a source of pride to Black journalists or Black people walking down the street, you know. So, you know, there's nobody stops me and asks my papers and says, let me see your Israel card or whatever it is, or you down with us. If anything, however, I will criticize, again, painting with broad strokes here, elements, let's put it that way, in the mainstream Jewish community for not embracing Black people enough, Black Jews enough. And it's not me. I'm not torn. I'm not crying into my beer. I'm not saying, oh my, I need to be accepted or whatever. The way I was raised, as you just heard, that wasn't an issue. But not everybody is like me, and I do feel that the younger generations are feeling the pain of rejection. So I'm going to throw out a name, Rachel Gilmer, who is one of the founders of the Movement for Black Lives and a person who inserted the Palestinian claim, one of them, into their platform. This, of course, as we all know, outrage in the Jewish community. How can you equate this? Why did you have to go there? This girl was Black and Jewish. She was raised Black and Jewish. She went to Israel. She was part of something active in her synagogue or Young Israel or something. And she got disenchanted. Now, the same thing happens with young white Jewish kids. And I will tell you, many of them become pro-Palestinian. But they don't get tainted and they don't get outcast, and they don't get blasted all over the place, and their movements are not completely disqualified because, oh my God, this Black woman has done this. So, you know, when you talk about acceptance, when you talk about rejection, let's talk about what we all can do to accept. What happened at that critical moment when this woman became a young woman that was missing?
Right. Thank you. So what I would like to do is ask both of you if you have any last comments that you'd like to give with us as we wrap up the time, any lessons that you would like to share, and also please, if you could unabashedly plug your book, Marc, your documentary, Robin, where we could see it if it's still on PBS, where we could find it. We would love that. So Marc, I'll let you go first.
Sure, absolutely. So my book is Black Power, Jewish Politics. Thanks so much for the plug. And I'll speak as an historian and as one who has specialized in the 1950s and 60s. And I also teach the US History Survey. To say that the moment we're in now is a once in a century historic moment. In terms of the level of consciousness, the level of protest, the intergenerational, interracial, inter-everything nature of this protest, we didn't even see this in the 50s and the 60s. And really it's been since Reconstruction that we've had this kind of national attention focused on issues of race and racism. And just in my own work, I'm finding a whole lot of white Ashkenazi, European descended Jews eager to learn a very difficult and challenging version of their historical past so that it can inform some work going forward. I heard from one of the TV commentators, sort of asked about this, like, do you think this change is actually going to happen? Well, I'm an academic, it's hard enough to predict the past. I can't predict the future. But what he said was, if we don't make it happen now, it's going to be another 100 years before a window such as this one opens again. So that's
right.
the moment now.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Marc. Robin.
I totally agree with that last part. Since I was around during those days, I would say that was a moment. I wouldn't say that this one is that much more of a moment, whatever, but regardless, they both were moments that, as you say, it don't come very often. I think of this as 1968, by the way, which is when the riots happened. And suddenly, I can speak for journalism, you had, did I say I was one of 10 Black editors of a daily newspaper, for 5 years ago? Well, 50 years ago, forget it. There were 0, 0, 0. They were journalists. They worked for the Black press. They found other things to do. When the riots happened and white reporters were getting beaten up, and by the way, it was usually a Jewish reporter because the Gentiles wouldn't go out and cover the stuff. Suddenly, Blacks were deemed qualified. There we go again, and they were hired. And we have what I call the class of 68, which is any number of African-American journalists who got their starts at that time. Unfortunately, those numbers went down in short order. They're way higher now, but they're nowhere near parity with the population. And so, yes, those moments do tend to get lost. The last thing I'll say about it is going back, recapitulating what we said in the beginning, what Professor Dollinger said about importing Black power and recycling it and reinventing it. That, to me, is the gift of the civil rights movement, and all movements, really. It's not so much exactly what they did and what march happened and what sit-in happened, but the philosophy behind the tactics, how you do something, what you do. And there was a comic book put out by a pacifist group where actually the Congress of Racial Equality got started. It was called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, still around. And in the 50s, they put out a comic book inspired by King, who they were advising on King and the Montgomery movement. It was meant to reach illiterate Black sharecroppers to get them into a nonviolent revolution following King. It missed its mark. Instead, it hit Black intellectuals, students, and three of the four participants in the Greensboro sit-in had read the comic book. Well, fast forward to this century, and the FOR is always very proud of this comic book, as they well should be. Somebody was sitting around and reading the history, and a group asked the FOR, can we reprint that comic book in Arabic? And that was right before the Arab Spring. So, the philosophy can be packaged and continue. But all of this philosophy requires that you think, that you figure your way out of something, that you come up with new and creative ideas, or take old ideas and reinvent them. And I'll end on this sobering note, which is to say, the Arab Spring was a great thing, but it also brought us Syria. So.
Right, right. Well, thank you both so much. I just want to point out in the chat section, you can find where you could get Marc's book and Robin's documentary. On behalf of Stephen Wise and AJC, we are so grateful that you guys are here. Thank you for spending your evening with us. And please make sure you mark your calendars and join us for the second program on October 28th at 7 p.m., where we will discuss perspectives on the present with moderator Rich Hirschout and panelists Elsie Granderson and Gina Green. And speaking of Rick, our director of AJC Los Angeles, I'm going to give the mic to him.
Thank you, Saba. And forgive me for a moment, I had to unmute. This was an extraordinary conversation. There is so much to unpack. I believe that I'm speaking for the audience as well. The subjects that were covered went deep, were poignant, were so beautifully expressed. I'm thankful that we recorded this session. That's a way of telling the audience that you can indeed go back and play this over. There were tremendous insights shared this evening. Professor Dollinger, your nexus between the movement for Soviet Jews and the Black Power movement, the 1971 Freedom Riders, and your curiosity to want to follow up what appeared at first blush to be a typo was a gift to all of us. Extraordinary. Robin, your instruction to the organized Jewish community to begin to walk the walk and not merely talk the talk with respect to diversity within our own leadership ranks is a message not lost upon us. It is important, and I was particularly moved as well by your reflection about Sábado Gigante, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, because I have friends who have been devotees and their parents devotees of Gigantic Saturday Night and everything that meant. Ladies and gentlemen, when we first began to discuss with Rabbi Stern and our partners at Stephen Wise Temple the idea of this series, we thought that the moment was right and ripe. We were no longer in the throes of daily protests and demonstrations on the street, but we wanted to gather the energy and the meaning of those protests and bring them forward in this moment of relative quiet, where we can be more reflective, where we can plan to genuinely move the needle on issues of race, social justice, and equity in our society. And it begins right here at home. It begins with the Jewish community and how we understand and interpret, and with that information, with that knowledge, with that enlightenment, begin to move forward. So as the first of our three-part series, you all hit it out of the park. And Saba, you were extraordinary in eliciting everything we needed to hear. So if we have sufficiently whet your appetite, please join us 2 weeks from tonight when I'll have the microphone in hand and the opportunity to engage 2 more extraordinary panelists, and for us to bring this legacy discussion into this present day moment and to really help clarify and understand and synthesize all that we need to learn and all that we need to take as we move forward. So on behalf of the American Jewish Committee, AJC Los Angeles, and our partners and dear friends at Stephen Wise Temple, particularly Ron Stern and his team, Rabbi Stern and his team, we are grateful for your joining us this evening and joining with us in this shared journey of understanding and illumination. There is so much work to be done in our society, but it begins with one step and another step forward, and we will make this trek together. It's worth it. America is worth it. The final comment, please vote. Vote like our democracy depends upon it, because it does. And with that, good night, and be safe and be healthy. Thank you.